Good evening. My name is Erin Lowe, and I am the Student Project Supervisor and a Student Project Manager at the Clark Forum for Contemporary Issues at Dickinson College. Before we begin, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge that Dickinson College is on the unceded lands of the Susquehannock Nation. We acknowledge the many Indigenous peoples who lived with these lands, as well as thousands of Indigenous children forced into the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in 1879 as part of a federal cultural eradication effort. On behalf of the Clark Forum, Dickinson College, and the Civil Dialogue Project, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, Free Speech on Campus. I grew up in a family with vastly different political beliefs from my own. We spent a great deal of time debating policy, political leadership, and what ought to constitute the values that inform political decision-making. I left many of these conversations feeling frustrated, to say the least. But in retrospect, they provided me with something invaluable. I was forced to humanize those who disagreed with me because they were the people I loved. In a world in which othering and intolerance prevail, I learned how to engage with those on the other side of the political spectrum with compassion and an understanding that while we don't always agree on solutions, we often agree on problems. I was lucky to have had an opportunity that many don't, and to continue to have the support of my family even when I started organizing protests and working on political campaigns for issues they didn't agree with. We have an obligation to ourselves and to our society to consider the extent to which free speech is desirable and the extent to which it is necessary. Furthermore, we cannot think about rights without also thinking of responsibilities. How can we make this world safer while still challenging unjust systems and behaviors? What will it take to ensure our society is one that is both just and free? Our speaker today is here to talk about the scope of free speech and its limits, as well as concepts such as bigoted and exclusionary speech, misinformation, and the boundaries of toleration. She will focus upon the mandate of higher education to promote and further knowledge in light of the speech controversies at colleges and universities that seem to pepper headlines with increasing frequency. Dr. Sigal Ben-Porath is a professor at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. She has chaired the university's Committee on Open Expression and the Penn Press Faculty Advisory Board, and she is currently a fellow at the university's Institute for Law and Philosophy. She has also been a fellow at Princeton University's Center for Human Values, the Institute for Advanced Studies, and the Edmund J. Safra Center for Ethics at Harvard University. Perhaps most relevant to her talk today, Ben-Porath has advised higher education institutions on policy related to speech controversies, and she authored the books Free Speech on Campus and Making Up Our Mind. Her forthcoming book, Cancel Wars, will discuss cancel culture, safe spaces, and the role of free speech in promoting democratic ideals. There will be a question and answer session immediately following the program, so please hold all questions until that time. For students participating in the Passport program, scan the QR code on the back of your program to track your attendance through Engaged. The Clark Forum welcomes differences of opinion expressed politely, thoughtfully, and succinctly. Disruptive behavior or harassment of the speaker, members of the Dickinson community, or audience members will not be tolerated. As a show of respect for our speaker and everyone in attendance, please stay until the end of the program, including the question and answer session. At this time, I ask you to please silence all cell phones and other electronic devices. And in the event of an emergency, please note that accessible exits are located on the west side of this building. And now, please join me in welcoming our guest, Dr. Ben-Porath.
Thank you so much, Erin. I almost feel like my work here is done. You know, I mean, you really express a lot of the core experiences and values that I'd like to discuss today through your own experiences and, of course, your learning. So I want to appreciate your introduction and acknowledge the other students who were hosting me today, Sophia and Shayna and Noah, and of course, Gary and the rest of the Civil Dialogue and Clark Forum groups. It's really great for me to be here. I'm excited to share this evening with you, and I appreciate you sharing yours with me. I'm trying to talk today about both of these books, which I put up here because I really like their covers. So I'm hoping you judge them by their covers. This book came out in 2017, and we were just saying, well, so much has happened since 2017. It really needed some updates. And so while the new book, which is Cancel Wars, is you know, I didn't change my mind on the core views that I'm going to talk about today in regards to campus open expression. But what I do try to do in the new book, which is where I'm going to start the discussion today, is I try to situate the debates over the boundaries of acceptable speech, debates that oftentimes we call debates about free speech. I try to situate them within the broader democratic, polarized context that we are all living in, and try to understand how our evolving views about what knowledge is, what truth is, what inclusion means, how these debates that really are not do not originate on college campuses, right? I mean, they are broader democratic debates, how they affect the ways in which we think about free speech, how they affect the ways in which we think about higher education, colleges and universities and their role, and of course, how they affect the intersection between higher education and open expression, which is where much of this discussion today is going to go. So I'm starting off with the current state of polarization. It's one day after the elections, you know, so you got to start with politics. And so basically what I want to suggest here, using other people's data, is that when we talk about polarization, which is really informing and organizing our current public life, oftentimes we think about polarization regarding issues or topics or policies that we care about. And clearly there are some policies. I think reproductive rights and the Dobbs decision, you know, are an easy example for that. There are topics about which we have strict ideological differences, right? Should abortion be accessible? Should it not be accessible? Right? This is a policy issue that clearly there is just strong disagreement, strong issue polarization about. However, about a lot of issues that are organizing our public life, which are represented here with the different lines, we actually don't necessarily, I mean, we oftentimes see eye to eye. We're not necessarily polarized about many of these topics or policies or issues that we're trying to make decisions about in order to organize our public life and public policy. However, what we do differ about is our feelings about each other, right? So we have a rising, what this line is doing right here is representing the rise in negative feelings that we have about people who vote differently than us. And Aaron was just telling us how, you know, sometimes when these are people you love, you got to work out these feelings, right? I mean, how can you be such a terrible person? Oh, no, you're actually, you know, my brother or sister, you know, or my parent. And so I think you're a nice person, so let's figure out, right? But a lot of us don't have this experience, right? Definitely not when we are young. And so a lot of us just feel free to go upstairs. It's fine. Don't worry about it. So a lot of us end up finding ourselves experiencing a sense of what some researchers call ideological contempt, right? Or sometimes it's called affective polarization, right? Our emotions towards other people, are becoming more and more polarized. If you're voting differently than me, I can't possibly like you. I can't be your friend. I can't share a dorm room with you. I can't, go out with you. So our feelings about each other are becoming more negative. And this really leads to a cascade of developments that we can generally call democratic erosion, right? So our basic democratic norms and practices and our institutions, but I really want to talk here more about democratic culture, is shifting and is eroding as a result of ideological contempt. And one of the places where I find it to be most expressed in the most pressing way is the space of our norms and boundaries regarding speech. So basically, we are experiencing an era. I'm sort of like running you through some of the key findings in, the last 10 years of research on polarization. So you kind of have to take my word on it, but I'm happy to talk about any of these in more detail. We are living in an era when many of us are experiencing reduced trust in institutions, governance institutions, and whether it's because we think the government is dysfunctional, or because we think it doesn't represent people like us, or because we think in other ways that the government needs to have a smaller role in public life. We have reduced trust in institutions, and as I said, we also experience reduced trust in each other based on our ideological differences. We are losing our ability to assume that the other person who is thinking differently than us or holds beliefs that are different than us is acting in good faith, that they are a good person and have good intentions and share some of our values and just has different views. We are losing the ability to assume that. We are losing, some big words, our shared epistemic foundations, which basically means, in other words, we don't know the same thing, right? So when we think, for example, about whether, we just lived through a pandemic, some people would say no. And then other people would say, well, of course we did, 1 million people died and so many people were sick, but then other people would say, no, this was actually something else that happened, or it was a result of the vaccines themselves or other explanation. Or when we look at climate and, we raise concerns about the changing climate and the contribution of human action on this, and then some people would say, no, what I know about this is actually something different, right? So the facts that are accessible to us are different, and as a result, it's very hard to make decisions together. It's hard to hear and understand each other because I can't see, why someone would think that wearing or not wearing a mask is such a big political deal, right? But when the facts that we are working with are distinct, it's hard for us to understand each other. Sometimes we see that people would continue to hold views that are based on facts that are very well known to be inaccurate, and that can be very frustrating. And some philosophers, especially one philosopher, Charles Mills, who I like quite a bit, calls this behavior willful ignorance. So he's saying, sometimes you know something different than me, or I know something different than you, but the facts are available to both of us, right? And the reality is accessible or can be known to both of us. But one of us insists on knowing something different, right? One of us insists on having a better understanding, or suggesting that the facts are inaccurate, or having different types of data that even if it was repeatedly disproved, they will continue to hold it. And so this, again, is a result of a mistrust in scientific institutions, in government data, and in each other, and then insistence in remaining within the boundaries of our own knowledge, even when it's misguided. And Mills calls that willful ignorance, he says, this is not ignorance that is a result of lack of access to information or not enough facts. It's an ignorance that fights back, right? It's an ignorance that insists on misguided notions or understandings of reality. And so that, again, is contributing to the loss of our shared epistemic foundations, right, or the loss of our shared understanding of reality. And as a result of all of these processes that I listed here in a pretty depressing way, and I promise you that there's going to be some more cheerful parts to the presentation, as a result of all of these, we do have fewer reasons to listen to each other, right? Factually, we do. It's not good, but that's the reality we live in. And we have more reasons to try and silence each other. And this is where what I call the cancel wars come in, right? I mean, this is where, or what, a lot of people call cancel culture, it comes in because, if your facts are different and I don't believe you have good judgment or good values and I don't believe that you're acting in good faith, of course, it makes sense for me to just cross you off and not listen. And that, I think, is, definitely, with the whole group of the civil dialogue colleagues here, I'm committed to saying, but I also truly believe that it's a real problem, right? It's a real problem that we have such a good reason to choose not to listen to each other and to try, and the fact that we have the tendency, the growing tendency, to try and ensure that diverse voices will not be heard. And so I'm trying to work through ways to address this whole mess, right, of democratic erosion as a result of the loss of trust and shared knowledge and a sense of shared values. Okay, so this polarization, of course, we can try to ignore it in college and try to just go about and do our things, but it's really interested in higher education. So polarization is coming to campus, even if campus is wanting to ignore it. And even when campus itself sometimes is quite homogeneous in terms of the opinions, at least, that are voiced in many of our public forums in some campuses. And so we are seeing that our polarized public sphere is being expressed in an affective or, again, emotional, distinct way in which we are thinking about higher education itself. Democrats and lean Democrats people tend to have a positive view of higher education and to think that going to college and having colleges active in our public sphere is a good thing. And Republicans tended to think the same thing in slightly lower numbers. And something happened in 2016 which caused a lot of Republicans to develop a more negative view of higher education and to think that it's really a net negative in our public life. And so we are having polarization in broader democracy. We're having polarization or experiencing polarization about knowledge, about each other. And now we have polarization over the very use of higher education. And as a result, we are seeing a spate of legislation that is trying to restrict or reorganize the way in which we are talking on college campuses. And similarly, which I won't go into right now because, because it's not a part of my plan, but I'm happy to talk about, and I definitely write about a lot, similarly in K-12 schools. But if we look at higher education, a lot of states are either passing or trying to pass bills that will limit, restrict speech on college campuses, sometimes under the banner of protecting free speech. So how does restricting speech protect speech? Of course, as I'm sure many of you know, much of the concern that is coming from conservative circles is about the lack of ideological diversity on college campuses, which is a reality, right? It's a factual reality that a lot of colleges, particularly in the Northeast and Mid-Atlantic, are living with. And so looking to restrict protests, expression that would limit conservative perspectives on college campuses, and by this action, expanding the breadth of views that are available for all to hear. So we have many legislative efforts to restrict speech in these ways. Some of them are restricting student protests, particularly in public colleges. Some of them are restricting the way that we teach history. Some of them are restricting conversation about gender and sexual diversity, both in school and in college. And some of them are just trying to restrict what faculty teach more broadly. So, okay, not great. So I'm worried about this, just to be clear. So I think we have some concerns that are shared across the aisle, but I think legislative actions are a form of overreach in my mind, and I'm happy to explain why. Oh, this video I'm not playing because we are doing a live stream, and so I can't play the video, but I will just tell you what's in the video, which is that we are seeing eruptions of struggles over the boundaries of speech in our classrooms and in our events, right? On many, many college campuses. This is a famous example, which I'm not showing you, which is a fight, serious disruption that happened at the Yale Law School when they had a discussion about the recent set of legislation about transgender student rights, from sports to medical care to all the other things, bathroom access. And so the Federalist Society, which is a conservative law student group, invited two speakers, one of them opposing the legislation and the other one supporting the legislation that restricts trans students' rights. And so the students here in the audience are protesting the invitation of the speakers who supports the legislation, right? The speaker who opposes trans rights. And so there's a big fight happening, the faculty person is standing up here and she's saying, oh, you cannot disrupt the event. We have regulations, that protect the speech of the speakers. And the students are standing over here. Here I am enacting the video for you. And they are saying, well, protest is also a form of speech, so we are also protected. So the fight is over trans rights. That's the content. But the actual interaction is around the boundaries of what we can and cannot say. Okay, I'm skipping that. And this is something that is happening on college campuses around the country, but it's really starting in schools. Okay, and I just want to clarify that the process of restricting speech and teaching young people that their views and perspectives and voices is not valued in society is a process that not only starts at K-12 schools, it has also started approximately 40 years ago. So it's definitely not new, right? So during the Vietnam War, which is a long time ago, we had a court case, the Tinker case, which approved student protest, in that case in the form of wearing a black armband to protest the Vietnam War that Mary Beth Tinker and her brother were wearing to school. And so that got all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, hey, is political speech is protected. Of course they can come with a black armband to school. Ever since that time, which again was a long time ago, all the decades since then, all the decisions that came to the Supreme Court about student speech resulted in further restriction on young people's expression. So even when we have courts that are super friendly to free speech and are always expanding the boundaries of speech and recognizing different entities and different forms of expression and different views as protected by the First Amendment, people under 18 are not included in that. And this is the most, so this is from 2007, so it's not that recent, but it's the more recent case. This guy, I just love him, so I have to put him in all of my slides. So so here is the Olympic torch passing through Juneau, Alaska. And so the school is letting the kids out to stand around and wave the little flags for the TV cameras when the torch is passing. And this guy, who is always likely to cause troubles, is unfurling this banner that says, "Bong hits for Jesus." What does that mean? I really don't know. So if you know, tell me. But the court also didn't understand what that means. But then they decided, okay, it's promoting drug use. You could say it's promoting religion, but the court said it's promoting drug use, and so it's not permitted. It's disruptive to the school activity, even though nobody is trying to learn, right? So it's not like the kid is in class is doing that. They are waving the little flags outside, right? But he got suspended for 10 days, and the court, and he sued the school for his First Amendment rights, and the court said, no, you can be suspended because you're promoting drug use. So from the Tinker decision and all the way down to the Bong Hits for Jesus decision, we have more and more justifications for restricting young people's speech. And then you probably heard about your neighbor up here, the cheerleader and it wasn't Instagram, Snapchat, and, you know, excuse my language for a second, fuck cheer and fuck school. And so the court said she can say that, but that's actually a case that is not so much about school speech and student speech, it's more about social media, so I'm putting that aside. So generally speaking, the courts don't like you, and they don't want to hear what you have to say, okay? And so then you all come to college, and we are like, oh, universities and colleges are for learning and for diverse opinions and for civil dialogue. Listen to each other. Here we love free speech. Knock yourself out. So we don't really teach young people how to engage with diverse opinions, again, unless their families are giving them a crash course, as we've heard. And so when young people come to college or university, they are basically oftentimes left to their own devices, figure out how to live with difference, right? And that's really not a productive use, you know, of your time, and it's not a fair demand, right? So what I'm trying to say here is that at the same time that colleges and universities are embroiled in this polarized environment in which they are being presented or framed as institutions that are you know, not contributing to democracy and not contributing to society. At the same time, colleges and universities are trying to figure out, right, the higher education as a sector is trying to figure out what to do about supporting young people who have no training in open expression and need to figure out a way to live with each other and to sustain democracy and to really overcome this polarized environment in which they are growing up. So it's a tall order, right? It's hard work, and you all, especially if you're Gen Z, we're counting on you, you're gonna fix it. So here is how we are hoping that you're all gonna fix it. At the university, basically, or in a college, what we are for is really tightly linked, right? Our core mission is tightly linked to these issues about which we are polarized, right? We are trying to search for knowledge and truth. We are trying to disseminate knowledge at the same time that we so much disagree on what is true and on what we know, right? Our epistemic foundations, as I said, are crumbling. We are trying to educate a diverse and engaged student body at the same time that we really have a strong disagreement about who belongs in our society, right? Who is a good citizen? Who is a good member I use the term citizen loosely, right, just to mean a good member of our society. And of course, we have to prepare people to have jobs later, and we have to prepare them to be citizens just on the side. So these goals really are all impacted by the polarized environment and by the struggles over speech, right? What is true knowledge that we can disseminate? What can we say to and about each other? So in this book, the 2017 book that I wrote, Free Speech on Campus, I'm developing a framework of trying to address some of these concerns and basically trying to clarify the way in which we can try to preserve our democratic freedoms, and specifically the freedom to express diverse opinions, how to reconcile that with the demand for inclusion, which sometimes leads us to limit speech, right? So, in other words, sometimes when we are trying to be inclusive and make sure that everyone belongs on our campus, we are saying, okay, let's make sure that we are not saying something offensive or hurtful. Let's make sure that we let everyone feel that they belong and that they are a part of our community. So we are going to cancel or silence or limit some speech, censor some speech that might be offensive, hurtful, inaccurate. But of course, you know, democracy and freedom pull us in the other direction, right? They call on us to try and ensure that everyone can speak their mind and share their views. And so this framework of inclusive freedom is really a framework that tries to reconcile these two values. To clarify, I'm not a lawyer, so don't take legal advice from me. This framework is, of course, operating within the legal boundaries of what is permissible in the United States, but it's an educational and relational approach rather than an effort to reinterpret the First Amendment in ways that align with current, you know, court precedent or something that I don't know anything about. We are looking, when we are applying inclusive freedom into our college environment, what we're trying to do is to expand and protect speech. So in other words, trying to make sure that people can voice their views, including diverse views, a broad ideological spectrum, people who have beliefs, including beliefs that are misguided, especially when they are students. So I'd be happy, of course, if the professors know what they're talking about, but the students can try out different perspectives and different opinions, even when they are not yet expected to be experts. But while we are expanding and protecting speech, as I said, we are sometimes crossing boundaries, and we are sometimes delivering messages that might be heard by people as harmful. And so an additional responsibility that inclusive freedom places on us is to ensure that the people in power, so it would be, you know, your professor in your class or your administration or, you know, other people that have responsibilities on your campus, that they share the burden that some people have to carry because we have protected speech. So in other words, I'm going back to the video that I didn't show you about the Yale Law School. If we are permitting speech that is hurtful, maybe harmful, definitely very painful to trans students and their allies and family members, and sometimes we are permitting this speech, right, because it's a debate that a student club organized, or because it's a perspective that exists in society and there are laws being passed about it. And so if we are law students or other students, we need to learn to understand these views. It's not an effort to persuade people to believe in them, but they have to know about them, right? But then we are creating burdens that are carried by trans or ally students, right? So the university has a responsibility to, or the school, the department, the professor have the responsibility to carry some of these burdens. And there are ways, you know, practical ways that they can do it. which I'll talk about briefly in a moment, and I'm happy to expand on. But the university or the people in power can really represent the values of inclusion even when they are permitting hurtful speech. And so basically creating an inclusive climate means that we are looking to ensure that everyone knows that they belong while protecting a broad range of open expression. It's pretty hard, but it's possible, okay? And so I want to talk about one distinction that I'm drawing in order to enact this, and then I'll offer some practices on how it can work on a college campus. So in order to know which speech, okay, so I'm saying we have to create an inclusive climate, right? Which means that we need to create shared norms, boundaries of what we can and cannot say. How do we know, right? What guidance do we have to decide what can and cannot be said, especially that sometimes people will say, but that hurts my feelings, right? And their report, we should, of course, respect that. But it's not always a reason to say, well, if it hurts your feelings, then we're not saying that ever again, right? Because that would be too restrictive. So how would we know where to draw the line? Okay, I'm drawing the line right here, okay, in the middle. And the line is between dignitary safety and intellectual safety, or as I'm setting it up here, dignitary risk and intellectual risk. It's the same thing, right? What does it say? It says the following. College is meant, and learning broadly depends on taking intellectual risks, right? You have to be able to consider ideas that haven't occurred to you before. Try on, beliefs or perspectives or forms of understanding that you just didn't, that you're just learning about, right? You're just expanding your boundaries. And so taking an intellectual risk basically means trying out new views, maybe because you hear somebody else says them, or maybe because you want to think, maybe I agree with that, right? But this can only be possible, that's my argument, within an environment that protects my dignitary safety. Or in other words, in order for me to be able to learn and to take intellectual risks, it is necessary, right, as a precondition that I know that my dignity is protected, that I know that I belong, that I know that I'm treated as if I know there are a couple philosophy majors in the room, right? So if I'm treated as an epistemic equal, right? I'm treated as somebody who has the potential to know and to contribute to the conversation. So dignitary safety advances the search for knowledge. It advances the capacity that we have to take intellectual risks. Okay, so Aaron told you not to ask questions during the presentation, but since I'm going to be done in a few minutes, if you have any questions about this, just raise your hand. Yes, go for it.
How do you integrate this as a professor into the classroom to ensure that students feel welcome?
Did you look at my next slide? Okay. Thank you for this question. So let's talk about how we integrate it into the classroom. Now that's a great question, and it is the logical progression of the, bless you, of the discussion. So okay, so we have a commitment to ensure dignitary safety and a commitment to ensure the capacity to take intellectual risks. How do we do it in the classroom? So I'm not going to go through, I have a lot of policies and pedagogical practices. I do workshops for faculty where I really go through pedagogical moves, right? So if some issue erupts, how do you respond to it? But basically what I want to say that the basic conditions for doing this in the classroom are as follows. You have to start off by setting shared norms of intellectual honesty, meaning you have to explicitly, when you teach, talk with your students about what the boundaries in this classroom are, and ideally create these boundaries with them, right? What are we trying to do here? What are we trying to learn about? It's gonna be different in the chemistry lab and in the ethics class, right? There are different norms. And so we have to create them together. You know, the professor is leading that, or the instructor, but we have to do it together. We have to plan, we instructors have to plan our classes around, among other things, the question of where are boundaries potentially being crossed, right? What can erupt in my class? Oftentimes I know, right? Here is a difficult topic. I know I'm bringing a difficult topic. Or I know my students already, and some of them either they like to push buttons or they have controversial views or whatever it might be. I know that. So I need to plan for that. And the plan has to include my responses to controversial views that come into class. For example, if there's a student that says something that clearly other students are offended by, I have a job. I can't move on, right? My responsibility, that's the point in the limits of lesson planning. Sometimes I make a fabulous lesson plan, and here is somebody saying two, misguided words, and the whole thing collapses. Oh, but I have my lesson plan, and I have to get back to it. But that's not my job. My actual job now is to fix this, what is actually happening in class. And if I'm not doing my job, then it's your job to tell me to do my job, right? So we cannot move on when something happened, right? And that's basically my call for instructors, right? It's part of carrying the burden. If I don't say anything, then whatever you said is left for the next person to carry, right? And I'm like teaching my lesson plan. What you learn from that is that it's fine to say whatever was said. And that's the wrong lesson, right? So, okay, again, happy to talk more about any of these things. I talked this, so there are a couple people here who have already heard this. I don't like civility. Ask me about this afterwards. I don't think it's a good framework for thinking about what we shouldn't say in class. I think civility is a formality. It's not an actual norm. So it doesn't do the work for us. And we, in this way, maintain an inclusive and open climate. So our goal is really that people can voice their views, right? So if somebody has, for example, wrong views or hateful views or the overlap of the two, and they are silent in my class, I will never know that. Now, maybe they are listening and maybe they will grow and learn something, and that's okay. But I think if we figure out a way for diverse views to be heard, we can share our perspectives about them. We can learn how to argue against them. Everyone is learning more when everyone knows that they can speak. Okay, all of this is about the classroom. I just found the clock, so it's okay. So it's basically my time is almost up. So I'm going to take still 2 more minutes to show you what else I have to say, and then we can move to your questions. So outside of class, there are different rules. They don't include setting fires to buildings. This is from Berkeley. We just talked about that. There are other rules, but the rules have to be organized around the effort to create a context that sustained a vibrant atmosphere of expression. It can be talks, it can be protests, it can be all sorts of exchanges, and it can be dialogue, especially across difference. So we can have our spaces where we only have people like us, whatever like us means by identity, by faith, by ideology. It's fine to have these spaces. It's actually good. It sustains you. It gives you a sense of safety and community and camaraderie. But we also have to figure out ways to build coalitions so that our voices are stronger around the values and goals that we have together. And so this really is calling out people and calling in people is really a phrase that I borrow from Loretta Ross, who is a marvelous activist and thinker about these issues. And she says, if somebody is saying something disagreeable, you have a choice to make. You can call them out, cancel them, right? You're a terrible person, you're hateful. And sometimes it's justified. But you can also try to call them in. You can say, tell me more, right? Why do you think that? What is this based on? Let me try to understand. What is it that we might be sharing despite our differences? And of course, you can decide to call them off, right? And just to not engage, and that's fine as well. And in practice, these principles can look like this. So this is one case that I was responsible for and worked out. So I'm showing you pictures from that. Some of them didn't work out so nicely. But here we have a speaker who is speaking against the Black Lives Matter movement. So she's really, her views are hurtful. They're also inaccurate in various ways, not related to the movement, but to her interpretation of the demands and the social conditions. But that's her, she was invited by a student group, and so she's speaking on my campus while I'm chairing the Committee on Open Expression. So that's my life. So she's speaking, and then of course the students are very mad about that. Some of them are. And so they are organizing a protest outside. This is where the room is, right? So it's really right near the event. And so people going into her talk are seeing this protest, right? And so we are basically making sure that this is happening, but this is also happening, and they are next to each other. And people can get a sense of, the diversity of views on that, and the sense that even though there's a speaker here who does not value the equity of particularly African-American citizens in this country, they are not, them organizing with their allies are not accepting this as, as a view that has room on our college campus. And so I think this is more or less the kind of thing that I hope can happen. And, of course, we have other people who we don't invite, but they still show up, and there are various ways to engage with their speech, which is hate-based, right? So they, but it's protected by the First Amendment. And so we are looking for ways to engage our students in, being funny or playing music or somehow living with the fact that this is protected speech in this country, and these are views that they have to encounter on the way to the library. So in sum, inclusive freedom on campus asks the question of who is included, what views are included, and how can we create shared norms for searching for and disseminating knowledge. Who is responsible for including people and topics, right? So we're looking for policies that will ensure diverse perspectives and the voices of diverse people. What recourse do people have if their expressive or dignitary needs are not met? What do I do when this doesn't work, right? I need good policies and practices for that. And we talked a little bit about birth and about other things that can be done, and it's important to enumerate those. And of course, most importantly, can the dialogue continue? Colleges are lucky to be long-term contexts, right? The conversation is never one-off. And so we have to ensure that we are creating the conditions for the conversation to continue. And with that, I'm inviting you to speak up.
Thank you so much. We will now begin the question and answer portion of tonight's event. Because the event is being recorded, please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to reach you prior to asking your question. We do reserve the first question for students, but after that point, we will open it up to the rest of the audience. And with that, we are searching for our first question.
Thank you so much for being here, and I wanted to first start by saying I really appreciate your words and your thoughts, especially in the climate of the United States and colleges, campuses currently. But my question for you is, what are your thoughts on freedom of speech when it comes into the realm of religion, spirituality, and non-religious identities? And especially if those identities may oppose other aspects of other people's identities? And likewise, what are your thoughts on speech that may be against religious, spiritual, and non-religious identities?
That's a great question. It's really a great question. And it's a very hard question for two reasons at least. One reason that it's hard is more technical, right? So it's hard to answer this question broadly because there are different rules for different types of institutions around speech, religious speech and speech about religion. So private institutions like this one have a different type, and I would say probably more latitude to make their own decisions about this, whereas public institutions, also depending on the state, but I'll put that aside, have different types of requirements in this regard. And of course, we have institutions that are themselves religious, right, or are affiliated with a denomination, and so they, again, have other rules. So this is the technical reason. But the more substantive reason that it's a hard question is that religion really is an organizing feature of democratic life. It's one of the identities that many of us carry, right? Whether it's being a part of organized faith or organized religion, whether it's just having our faith and practicing it beyond organized groups, and whether sometimes it's being either unaffiliated, a committed atheist, right, or various other views that one might have about religion and its role in public life. And so these identities are sometimes less evident to us, right? We don't see them immediately in all cases. Sometimes we do. And so sometimes we can speak about people without knowing that we're doing that, right? And so that's, one of the challenges that we're facing in this regard. I think that generally speaking, if I can say something general about this, in unaffiliated institutions, so if it's not like a Catholic university or in unaffiliated institutions, the main role of religion belongs to student self-organizing, right? And so, for example, there is an active group of Catholic students on my campus who are opposed to reproductive rights as a core aspect of their religious belief. And so they organize sometimes public displays, in opposition to abortion. And in that, they are reflecting their religious views. Some people find it offensive, and a lot of people, like on my campus, there is a lot of support, more support in the student body to reproductive rights, and so more students are pro-choice, and so they're, but I actually think it's a healthy exchange in the sense that here is a view that is quite common in society, It's more common to support, right, as we've seen even yesterday, But it's, even if it's just 30 or 40% of the country who have various, views on that side, it's good to hear that. And it's good to see that. And it's good to be exposed to that. And so I think, normally speaking, students can organize and voice their views. And that's good, especially when they are minority views, right, numerically. Now, if they are going to voice views that are offensive to others, then there are ways to try and organize that. Again, there are lines that the community can decide that you cannot cross, right? Can you say, that because I disagree with your religious beliefs, then you can go around like these priests, up here in the previous picture and tell me that I'm going to hell, for example, for being Jewish, which they do. They are not members of the community. So again, they are protected by the First Amendment. I can't do anything about that. Can a student group or club do that? I think that's, inappropriate, likely, right? To say, if you're Jewish or if you're gay or whatever it might be, like, if your identity makes you less than me, I would say that public displays of this belief can probably be restricted to the extent that they are harmful. And if people want to sit around and have a club and talk about how, I don't know, people shouldn't be gay, I don't know. I mean, if they want to talk to each other about this, fine. But I don't know that that it belongs in many colleges to the domain of public life. I think.
Howdy. That was so much louder than I expected. I'm so sorry. I was curious, in your opinion, on the role of educators, specifically teachers or sort of organizers of discussion, in more fraught situations or discussions around things like identity, politics, religion, and the interconnectedness of all of those things. The role or responsibility that leaders of that have in expressing their own positionality, either as a grounding for a understanding of different perspectives or an understanding of, as you talked about earlier, a base level of the reality or understanding of the world that people are coming from.
Right. So if I understand your question correctly, you're asking me about whether instructors should be disclosing their own views about some of these matters. Is that the main part of your question? Or, yeah.
At the very least, influences that may lead to those views, like background or personal upbringing experiences, et cetera.
Right. So I would say, okay, so for me, these are two separate things. Like, do I come to class and talk about, my faith or my family background? Or, obviously I can't hide being an immigrant because I talk all the time. And so you can hear that. But, what if I could, change my name and my accent or something? So do I have to talk about my identities? I think that's a matter of personal, taste. Some people like doing that and some people don't, and I think that's fine. But the question of really disclosing my views, especially when they pertain to something that I'm teaching, I think, is actually a more difficult question, right? Because, and it's, it's difficult in college, and I would just say it's even more difficult in K-12 settings, right? Do I say what my views are about certain things that are relevant to my teaching? And there's a big literature on teacher disclosure and when it's appropriate and why. I actually think that in college, you can kind of leave it as well to the teacher to decide what their pedagogical practice is going to be around this. But I do think it's really important for instructors to recognize that even though their students are not 8 years old and they are not influenced, the teacher said she likes vanilla ice cream, so I'm going to have that too. I mean, you don't have this kind of just like trailing after the teacher that you see in younger ages. You still have influence, if not for the positions that you express as your views, for the way that you construct your syllabus and your class, right? So your values, those are steeped in your perspectives and knowledge and values and understanding of the world and, prioritizing what's important. And so I think really the main way, in my view, to deal with it, whether the teacher chooses to, speak about themselves in this way or not, is to be clear about the grounding of the knowledge that you provide, right? So when you talk about someone else's research, you give the reference, right? That's natural, right, in our practice. When you talk about your own views or interpretation, you just say that. You say, look, people have different views on this. Let me tell you mine, right? And let's talk about counter-arguments. So I really think it's important. One of the things that colleges are blamed, mostly incorrectly, but not entirely incorrectly, is that they are trying to indoctrinate students to believe in certain ideologies. I don't think that's true. I don't think professors come to class trying to indoctrinate students, even though part of the reason why we are polarized about higher education is this perception that this is what we do in class. My sense is that this is not the case, but that sometimes we neglect to acknowledge the influences of our own perspectives, not necessarily ideologies, our own experiences and identities and perspectives on what it is that we choose to teach. And given that in many, though not all, colleges, you have a greater representation of progressive and left-leaning professors than in the broader country because of factors that have nothing to do with their job, but it has to do with levels of education and where colleges are located more than anything else. But it's still a fact, right? And so we do have to just be realistic about it and be aware of that and reflect that in our work. Here is where I'm telling you about research findings. Here is where I'm telling you about one possibility to interpret them, and there are other ones, and we can consider those. I think there were a couple questions somewhere here. Yeah.
When you were discussing in the classroom someone bringing up an idea that is either hateful or wrong, I was wondering how you draw the line of something that is inherently wrong, whether you use something that is based on current scientific findings, or if you consider the idea that, obviously those ideas are always evolving and what we understand now is different than what we may understand in the future.
Well, it's a good question, and again, it's a little bit hard, like with this answer right there. It's a little bit hard to draw it in the abstract, right? How do I draw the line? Generally speaking, because, I teach a class on this and that topic, I'm at least, a pretty good expert, I know something about the topic, even beyond, the syllabus is something I studied or I do my research on. And so ideally, a lot of views and perspectives that can come up, I should have, not all of them obviously, but a lot of them, I should have some working understanding of whether they are accurate or not, and I can offer that in response, You think this, but in fact, we have a lot of research that shows that, or there are diverse opinions on this, so let's talk about those. And sometimes I don't know, and so then, as I'm sure you've heard many times from your professors, let me try to look into that, and I'll tell you next week or next class. But it's harder when something is hurtful, right? And it can be hurtful and true, and it can be hurtful and misguided, right? And so, again, like all of these distinctions are something that is very hard to do on the fly if you haven't thought about this before. That's why I said that we are responsible to think ahead when we prepare our class. What are the pitfalls, right? What can be some issues that come up here? What can I understand about this? And how can I prepare for people to say something that might cause pain? I don't think pain is a part of learning. You know, expanding your views, maybe confusion, discomfort, you know, like, oh my God, wait, I always thought this, and all of a sudden you're telling me that. Like, what are you saying, right? But that's not pain, right? That's intellectual risk-taking, as I was trying to say. Pain is when I'm saying, look, somebody like you cannot do that, right? Or when I say, or your peers say something that's humiliating you, right? That is basically expressing the view that you don't belong here for some reason, right? And that's painful, and that's completely unproductive, right? And so it's my job to express that it's unproductive, untrue, unproductive, both. But the tricky part is that I have to do that without shaming the person, right, to express this view. So my goal, look, sometimes there would be a person who is like persistently just offensive, you know, they want to hurt other people's feelings. And so I'm not saying that it's my job to always include them and be nice and try to accommodate every single time they do the same thing again. But if I'm assuming either that they act in good faith, or at least that they are redeemable, right? Which I have to assume, otherwise I have no job being a teacher, right? Maybe they won't even get it until they finish college, but maybe in 5 years they will think back and they will figure it out. You know, so I have to assume that it's gonna, you know, that there is at least a chance that it's gonna work out. And so if I shame them, I ruin this chance, right? And so basically my job is to try and figure out a way to make it less or not painful for the person who's hurt without shaming the person who's causing the harm, right? It's hard work, but it can be done, you know, like kindergarten teachers do it every day, you know. So we can do it in college too. Okay. Did you have a question, or did I make it up? No. It's okay. Oh, moving on. Okay.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for taking the time to be here this evening. On one of the earlier slides, you mentioned civility and its limits.
Oh,
yes. I was
yes.
wondering if you could expand on that, what kind of limits you think civility has as a tool for shaping public discourse.
Great. So with apologies to the people who heard it this morning, I'm going to say it briefly one more time. Civility is oftentimes used as the proper norm or boundary for acceptable expression, right? Let's all be civil. We need to act in civil manner. And this is the boundary of the way that we should speak to each other. And I think that's useless. And the reason that I think it's useless is twofold. The first part of it is that I think civility is, you know, you could call it maybe elitist, right? But it's enforcing a perspective of proper behavior that is developed in some part of our culture, and it's basically imposing it on everyone else, even when their families or their cultures or their groups just don't act like that. You know, it's just not their norm. And when you have a diverse campus and diverse along cultural lines and diverse along international lines sometimes, then people just have different norms about that. And pretending like we all know how to be civil in the same way, is quite, it silences too many people. And it especially silences people who do not have the power to express their pain from the previous question, right? So what do we do if, I stand up here and I have, the power in my class, for example, or my department, and I persistently act in ways that are hurtful to someone, and then they erupt and they're like, you know what, I can't listen to that anymore. You're being uncivil, right? So now they are wrong. So I just think it's not a good, it's not a good boundary and it's not a good norm for deciding what can and cannot be expressed, can and cannot be said, especially in the learning community. If I'm hurt, what if I'm crying? That's uncivil. What if I raise my voice? That's uncivil. But you're not giving me enough pathways to express what is bothering me. So that's my concern. And the other part of it is that I think we can speak in civil ways and say terrible things that actually shouldn't be said. So civility doesn't help us enough. It silences too much, and then it leaves in too much. It's performative. I'm looking for norms that are substantive. And so that's my beef with civility, right? I mean, I think it's good to be nice, right? I mean, we should be nice, but that doesn't take us very far.
We have time for one more question.
Yeah, right here.
Hi, thank you for coming to speak here. I just wanted to ask about over the last 5 to 7-ish years, I guess, there's been a lot of people on the alt-right, I guess you could say, that have infiltrated intellectual circles and disguise hateful rhetoric under terms that seem nicer or don't seem as aggressive. And I guess you talked a lot about with the classroom example, debating ideas and discussing ideas instead of just silencing them. So I guess my question was what's your general take on that?
Right. So actually what you're saying here is that we can be civil but express terrible ideas, right? So that's really where, I'm agreeing with that. And I think we are seeing that expressed in our public spheres sometimes, right? We have bigoted, racist or anti-LGBT or whatever ideas, that are sometimes hate-based, right? And they are expressed in ways that are civil and appropriate and acceptable, and so they enter our political conversation. And if we are not concerned with performance of civility, but we are concerned about sustaining everyone's dignitary safety, then it's easier for us to see how to draw these lines and how to organize our norms our norms of conversation. Sometimes, depends on the context, sometimes I think there is use in hearing views on the margins of acceptability, right? So sometimes in the proper environment, you know what? So I'm Jewish, as I already voiced. At the history class, we read Mein Kampf, written by Adolf Hitler, and really expressing views that not only are hurtful, but actually physically, exterminated a whole branch of my family. I think there is use in reading that, sometimes depends on the context. Now, if my friend or my professor stands in class and voices that these are his views, that's a different thing, right? If I'm watching a movie or I'm seeing the person, it's a different thing. But I think, and some of these are unproductive and shouldn't be a part, right, of our learning environment. And some of them are actually useful. It's good to know what's out there. It's good to know what's out there because it is out there. You know, if I don't listen to people who hold views that I find to be hateful, they don't go anywhere. You know, and they still vote, right? So I'd better figure out what it is that they worry about. Why do they think that? What can I, you know what? What concerns do I share with them? Maybe none. Sometimes it's none, right? But maybe something, you know, like, is there any common ground? Note, not middle ground. I'm not a fan of middle grounds. Is there any common ground that we can stand on and try to think together about something? And, you know, if the answer is no, and, you know, my example of Mein Kampf obviously is an example of a place where the answer is no, then okay, then at least I know what is out there and try to figure out ways to argue against it, right? But I wouldn't know before I heard. And so, like, my effort is to try to be able to be safe enough and to create enough of a community that would allow me to listen without it undermining my sense of efficacy and belonging and my knowledge that I am a part of this conversation and that you are and that everyone else is, right? So this is basically my goal in maintaining a broad range of views being expressed while making sure that they don't undermine these basic norms of a learning community. And I think with that, I'm probably going to stop. Thank you. I really appreciate it, and I know we left some questions on the table, so I'm happy to answer them if they are still pressing for anyone.
That concludes tonight's program. Thank you all so much.